Now we come to the end of our series on the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles is a mixed bag. On the one hand, you've got a Wilsonian idealism that deals with national self-determination, a League of Nations to keep everything together, but this produces a bunch of microstates. The French established some alliances called the Little Entente, but in fact this doesn't assuage at all the French fear of a resurgent Germany. They get the demilitarization of the Rhineland. They also get a bunch of arms limits on the Germans. The Germans are allowed an army not to exceed 100,000 men, which is a police force by early 20th century European standards. The Germans are not allowed to build tanks, military aircraft, naval warships, Unterseeboots. They're not allowed to build modern weapons or artillery for a certain number of years. The Germans are to be demilitarized. These arms limits are going to give the French a degree of comfort. But the fact is, the Americans take this idea of limiting arms one step further. Remember the effect of Alfred Thayer Mahan's The Influence of Sea Power on History. That book changes the world. The effects of the dreadnought race that drive Britain into the alliance with France and Russia. Well, right at the end of World War I, another dreadnought race seems to be in the offing, this time between the Royal Navy of Britain and the United States Navy, as to which navy is going to be supreme. Well, taking a page from Wilson, which isn't something that normally happens in the 1920s, the American administration decides to invite the major naval powers to a treaty conference in Washington in 1922. At this conference, strict naval arms limits are proposed. Limits that give, for every 5 British battleships, the Americans are allowed to have 5. The Japanese 3, the French and Italians 2 and 1. Now, this is because the British have worldwide commitments. The Americans want a 2-ocean navy. The Japanese are only strong in the Western Pacific. And the French and Italians primarily are Mediterranean powers. The Japanese are not happy about this. But at this point, there isn't much they can do other than agree, because it seems like, well, they haven't yet built up to the limits that the treaty would allow. So this will buy them some time. But the Japanese are not happy about the failure to include a racial equality clause in the League of Nations, and they're beginning to break away from their British alliance towards what they'll ultimately do that'll cause the beginning of World War II in the Pacific and in China. So, limits on naval arms are agreed to at the Washington Conference. And really, in theory, it's an extension of what happened at the Versailles Conference, this idea of a utopianism that's going to prevent war by preventing the weapons of war from being built in profligate numbers. The Washington Naval Treaty does, in fact, prevent an Anglo-British arms race that could have provoked a war between the United States and Britain in the late 1920s. It also allows countries to save a lot of money because they don't have to create a bunch of dreadnought battleships and battle cruisers. But Versailles' insistence on a German war guilt clause so that they will pay indemnities, which is a fee that a loser pays to a victor at the end of a war, is going to embitter the Germans. The loss of Danzig, Memel, parts of East Prussia, West Prussia, Posen, parts of Silesia, Alsace-Lorraine maybe, parts of Holstein, Eupen and Malmedy, these are going to also embitter the Germans. The fact that Germany is impoverished, the fact that Germany negotiated an armistice on the basis of what they thought was Wilson's 14 points, which would have led to a peace without victory to some extent. And now, instead of that, we're getting the Treaty of Versailles, a treaty that demands that they accept guilt for something that's not their fault, that carves up Austria-Hungary into a bunch of little states, that carves Germany up, that makes... The Germans are not going to be happy about this long term. The Soviets, they accept that capitalist countries are their enemies. They are the enemies of the Versailles powers. Now, actually, in 1918 through 1923, there's a civil war in Russia, which we'll talk about. Part of that civil war involved a Soviet invasion of Europe that the Poles stopped at what is called the miracle at the Vistula, the Battle of Warsaw in 1920. Had the Poles lost, it's entirely possible that the Soviet army would have joined up with German Spartacist communist revolutionaries, and the revolution would have been exported westward. But that didn't happen thanks to Poland. But the Russians are going to also be enemies of Versailles, and they're going to work covertly with the Germans to develop armored warfare, warplanes, things like that. The Germans are going to do a lot of training. So Germany and the Soviet Union, after World War I, are going to be friendly to one another. However, the biggest problem is that Wilson comes back to the United States having negotiated a treaty with only Democrats to a Republican Senate, a treaty that is idealistic for most Americans, and a treaty that expects that America will get involved in collective security and start policing the world, something that we're not ready to do in 1919, 1920. So it becomes clear that Wilson's treaty is going to fail in the Senate. Wilson then goes on a whistle-stop tour, traveling across the country by train, speaking, to encourage people to insist that their senators vote for the Versailles Treaty, whereupon he collapses. He has a physical collapse. He's bedridden. He can't speak. What do you think would normally happen? Oh, the treaty is gone. Treaty is canceled. Normally, most Americans would say, well, the president's incapacitated. The vice president becomes president, temporarily or permanently. No. Wilson married after his first wife died when he was president. He married a woman named Edith, and Edith Wilson became our first female president. At the end of 1919, when Wilson collapsed, through the end of his term in 1921, Edith Wilson was the intercessor between all of the cabinet ministers, the Congress, the military, and President Wilson, who is in his bed, basically paralyzed, incapable of interacting with the outside world. What Edith Wilson does is she goes over to his bed, explains things to him, whisper, 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 and then puts her ear up to his mouth. And she nods, as if he's saying things. And then she says, okay, the president says do this, this, and this. And the American government functions this way. It's very strange. In any event, the treaty fails. Without American participation in collective security, without American financial participation in making the League, which is based in Geneva, Switzerland, be an effective body, the League of Nations is crippled at the outset. Who's going to guarantee collective security? The exhausted French? The exhausted British? Without the United States, the League of Nations really isn't going to work as intended, and collective security becomes more of a bluff than a policy. The colonies. At the end of World War I, the German colonies have to be disposed of. But the idealism of the Versailles Treaty made colonies so passé, so old-fashioned. So instead of calling them colonies, talk about euphemisms, the League of Nations calls the former German colonies mandates. And the League grants a mandate to powers to rule these colonial regions in such a way as to bring the local population to civilization with a intention to long-term towards independence. So the League of Nations is going to replace old-style hardcore European imperialism with sort of nation building, The South Africans get German Southwest Africa, Namibia, and they are supposed to rule it within League of Nations ideals and with the intent of bringing the Namibian people, the black Africans who live there, up to a level of civilization where they can take part as an equal country in an industrialized world. It doesn't work that way. The Japanese rule their mandate territories as harshly as they ever have. The South Africans do the same. The British make some efforts in Tanzania, but in fact, it's just window dressing. It's not real. Finally, the long-term effects and short-term effects of World War I. Next.